Well, welcome again to Forest Lawn. My name is Amizetta. Hi, I'm the Director of Community Engagement here at the cemetery, and I'm very excited to be taking you on our new tour. It's a fun season. I know we have a lot of excited people here tonight. I hope I fulfill your dreams of this tour. And we were part of what was called the Rural Cemetery Movement in America. And the intention was to take our burial grounds outside of our busy and very crowded cities and create a more beautiful place, not only to bury our loved ones, but to go and enjoy visiting them and to enjoy time out in nature. Cemeteries like Forest Lawn predated the park systems in the United States, and so Forest Lawn and many other rural cemeteries were actually designed like parks so that people could really come and enjoy time either walking or reading a book or just visiting their loved ones. So Forest Lawn is a beautiful landscape cemetery that started with about 80 acres of property. It has grown to 269 acres of property, and we were originally 2.5 miles outside the city of Buffalo. But of course, since the mid-1800s, not only did we grow, but the city of Buffalo grew, and it grew around us. And so what was a very rural environment is now very much an urban environment. But we are still a very special place that takes very good care of our permanent residents, as we refer to them, and create a park-like setting for the community of Buffalo to enjoy. And so you being here tonight kind of helps us carry on that legacy of how Forest Lawn was founded. So everyone knows Angola, New York. And I want to take you back to a very fateful afternoon. On December 18th, 1867, a train left Cleveland at about 6:40 in the morning, and it was departing to go to Buffalo and arrive around 1:30 in the afternoon. This train was a New York Express traveling on the Lakeshore Railroad system. The train was made up of 3 first-class passenger cars, 1 second-class passenger car, and 4 baggage cars, and of course the engine that led the train. There's something else you should know about these cars. They are what's known as compromise cars. So compromise, of course, means give and take, right? They were designed so that they could run on both the New York Standard Railroad gauge as well as the Ohio gauge, which is what the Lakeshore Railroad line operated on. And so the compromise was in the design for the gauge system. These were also wooden cars, and they had 2 pot-belly stoves on either end, coal-fired stoves, and they were lighted with kerosene lamps. So this was, a very comfortable, heated, lighted, very progressive way to travel in the mid-1800s. Something else you should know about these cars, what they didn't know themselves, was that the front axle was bent on the engine. And so they were traveling with a little bit of damage they weren't aware of. Something else you should know about these cars, they were traveling at very high speed. And that is because around 3 in the afternoon, they were approaching Angola when they were supposed to have arrived in Buffalo around 1:30. So they were running very far behind. So it was a perfect storm of events. They were traveling at high speed. They were traveling with a bent axle. They were traveling on the Ohio gauge in compromise cars. And these cars would shift a little bit on the Ohio gauge because they were better suited for the standard gauge. And all of this together would come to a heap when they hit a frog in the railroad crossing. So that's when 2 lines crisscross, it's called a frog. And they're going at very high speeds, and the last car detaches from the train, and it goes 40 feet down into the gorge that they are traveling over. So they're crossing over what is called Big Sister Creek in Angola. And the bridge still exists, but it's not utilized anymore. And so the last car detaches from the train, goes 40 feet down into the gorge, and it lands at a 45-degree angle. Now this car has just shy of 50 passengers in it, and they are all thrown to one end of the car. And what's on that end of the car is one of the stoves. And then what happens is the other stove from the other end of the car detaches, and it falls on top of them. So these poor people are kind of crushed between 2 very hot stoves. And then, as I mentioned, it was lighted with kerosene lamps. And these are wooden cars. So what happens next? The car goes up in flames. Only 1 person escaped from this car. Altogether, there were 49 people who lost their lives. And at the time, this made national headlines as one of the worst railroad accidents in American history. And it became known as the Angola horror story. But the gentleman that we're here to talk about, his name is Alfred P. Southwick. Has anyone heard of him before? This is the gentleman we're speaking of tonight. Mr. Southwick was a steamboat engineer. At least that's how he started his career. He was trained in dental medicine and actually became a professor at the University of Dental Medicine at Buffalo, the University of Buffalo today. But what would be of most note in his lifetime was when he dabbled in invention. And he was inspired when he was down at the docks one night and he watched an intoxicated gentleman touch a live electric wire and basically electrocuted himself to death, and claimed that he thought that he didn't suffer much and that it seemed rather painless. Now, I don't know if the alcohol had anything to do with that, but nonetheless, this inspired Dr. Southwick to dabble in the method of electrocution. And his initial intention was really of good heart, I suppose. He really wanted to help the Buffalo SPCA because they were overrun with stray animals and they needed a humane way to euthanize these animals. And I don't know if the Buffalo SPCA ever did this. I can't find any evidence to support it either way. But it didn't really matter because Southwick would go on to come up with a better idea for his invention of electrocution, and that would be to use this as a method for capital punishment. Because this is the late 1880s, so time period reference. Hanging was still the method of execution in this country, and there were many botched hangings around this time period. And so Southwick thought, we can do this better. So in 1886, he was appointed by the governor of New York to a 3-person commission in which they were to discuss and make recommendation on the best way to go ahead with capital punishment in New York State for the future, a more humane way. And in doing so, Southwick came up with the concept of the electric chair. Now, he was a dentist. He was used to working on patients in chairs, so the chair was just a natural thought for him. And in January 1st of 1889, New York State actually made the electric chair the preferred method of execution for capital punishment. If you wanted to be buried in the family lot, like so, yeah, just like no, but I'm just. All right, we are at the unmarked grave of a woman by the name of Matilda or Tilly Ziegler. And there is not much known about Miss Ziegler and her life, but I will tell you that she did die on March 29th of 1889, and she was a victim of homicide. And Tilly was from Pennsylvania, and she came to the Buffalo area with her common-law husband. His name was William Kemmler. So one night, Billy had been out late drinking. He came home pretty riled up, and he accused Tilly of planning to steal from him and run off with one of his friends. Of course, she said, "Billy, no, you're crazy. I don't know what you're talking about." And the argument really reached a peak. William, or Billy, went out to their barn in the back of their house, and he got himself one of their hatchets. He calmly walked back into the house and bludgeoned Tilly to death by hitting her 26 times in the head. So it was quite gruesome. That's about as gruesome as I'm going to get tonight. He admitted it to what he'd done. In fact, he went right over to a neighbor's house, told them what he had done, and they alerted the authorities. Tilly was taken to a local hospital where she later succumbed to her injuries. William was promptly arrested, and he was quoted as saying that "I did it, I killed her, and the sooner I hang for it, the better." Well, he was tried, and he was sentenced to death, and what he didn't know is that he would never be hung in New York State, because on January 1st, 1889, what do we know happened? New York State adopted the electric chair as its preferred method of execution. So Mr. Kemmler actually was sent to Auburn Prison, which is the picture of the electric chair I showed you. That was the execution chamber that he eventually would succumb to death in. And he sat on death row there until August 6th of 1890, in which he calmly prepared for his execution, dressed up, and said that he was ready to meet death and that he knew he was going to a better place. Actually, Alfred Southwick was present at his execution, along with 17 other witnesses. In fact, the execution itself for Mr. Kemmler also did not go well. Although Mr. Southwick claimed that it did, and that 10 years of his work had culminated into progress for civilization, as he put it. However, the other witnesses had a very different interpretation of what happened that day. And again, I'm not going to get into too many gory details, but it did take 3 jolts of electricity and 8 minutes to kill William Kemmler. But Tilly, of course, was interred here. Now, a lot of people ask why there's no marker for Tilly. Typically, when there's no marker on a grave, either the family chose not to place one or they couldn't afford to place one. And my guess for Tilly, it was probably the latter. In this section. And I'm not going to really be able to point out much because it's so dark out now. He was originally from Maine, and he moved to the Buffalo area and kind of claimed it as his new hometown. He studied as an architect, and he actually went to Yale University as well, graduating in 1875 with a degree in civil engineering. And he then went to France and studied at l'École des Beaux-Arts, which is the School of Beautiful Arts, if you translate that. And would eventually, like I said, come back to the United States and settle here in Buffalo and start up his architecture career. And we have him to thank for several things around Western New York, but 2 of which that are probably the most notable would be the mosaic floor in the Ellicott Square building. Another building that he designed, along with his brother, who is also an architect, I'll turn this sideways, is the Unitarian Universalist Church on the corner of Elmwood Avenue and West Ferry. So you might be familiar with this as well. So 2 of his probably bigger contributions to architecture here in Western New York. And he decided to take a trip when he was in his late 50s, about a 2-month stint traveling through Europe, visiting France where he had gone to school, and also Egypt. Just a few other bucket list places that he wanted to go in his lifetime. But he decided to delay his trip home because in April of 1912 he wanted to be part of the maiden voyage of the RMS Titanic. So I think you're all familiar with that story. And he would only be on the ship for about 4 days before it hit an iceberg on April 14th, and as we know, would sink in the middle of the night around 2:20. And there were a little group of writers that would gather and meet on the ship, and they had a little name for themselves. It was a French name, our coterie, and Mr. Kent became one of their friends. And on that fated night when they hit the iceberg, they all kind of were looking for each other as they were scattering around the ship and trying to get to safety in the lifeboats. And Mr. Kent helped Miss Candy enter a lifeboat, and in doing so, you have to remember, ladies didn't have pockets at the time. Also, you were not allowed to take any of your personal items on the lifeboats. She handed him a flask and also a little ivory and gold miniature. You know the story, don't you?
Yes, they really are good.
A little ivory and gold miniature depicting her mother. A little ceramic, if you're familiar with those from the time. And she asked him to hold on to them for safekeeping. For some reason, she felt that he had better luck at making it through this disaster than she did. But unfortunately, that would not be the case. Mrs. Candy would survive, and so would Archibald Gracie, although he had quite the disaster going down. If you've never read his account, it's really harrowing, and I encourage you to do so. But Mr. Kent was seen going below deck many times, coming up with supplies, helping people into lifeboats, but he was lost in drowning with the Titanic going below water. And his body was recovered, and in his pocket was still the little miniature and the flask. And those items were returned to her, eventually returned to her, and his body was brought back here to the United States so that his family could inter them here in their family plot. So that was our last official stop on tonight's tour. I hope you not only learned something about some of our residents, but had a little bit of fun and got a little spooked in the process. So we are going to be offering this tour again next year, but I will probably be changing some of the stops, so they'll be a little bit fresh. Might keep a couple that are really popular, but please know that it will be a little bit different tour. And when we get up to the front, I will ask you to just turn your lantern off as you deboard the trolley and just hand it to either myself or to Ron. So this is one of those like odd buffalo facts you can share with your friends now, that a buffalo dentist invented the electric chair.